The 18th of June 1944. Northern outskirts of Evresis, Normandy. British ground forces were advancing along a narrow corridor when the first reports reached brigade command. German armor was regrouping behind the village, preparing a counterstrike that could break into the flank of the British line. Forward observers watched the ridge where the enemy assembled, certain the angle made an air attack impossible. The slope shielded the armor, the tree line concealed their movement, and the approach path offered no direct line for fighters to descend without entering a lethal web of anti-aircraft fire. The call still went to the RAF. And within minutes, a formation of Typhoons swept low over British positions, engines roaring as they angled toward the ridge in a trajectory no one expected. Infantry turned their heads upward, stunned at the steep banking maneuver carving across the battlefield. The German armor crews below froze, unable to comprehend how aircraft had appeared from that direction at all. The British troops braced as the Typhoons dropped toward the ridge with absolute precision, their attack run cutting directly into the heart of the German assembly point. The RAF strike that stunned the British infantry on the ground had not appeared out of improvisation. It was the product of weeks of British planning, intelligence gathering, and the steady refinement of air-ground coordination in Normandy. Ever since the landings, the RAF had been working to close the gap between what ground commanders needed and what air power could reliably provide inside terrain that favored German concealment. The hedgerow belt, with its steep banks and abrupt slopes, created angles of approach that traditional air doctrine struggled to use. Yet British pilots had learned quickly that the only way to break German counterattacks was to strike them at the precise moment of assembly, before they launched. The situation outside Evresis developed exactly along those lines. German commanders had been shifting armor to probe for weaknesses in the British front. These movements were detected not through direct sighting but through a sequence of small indicators the British had grown skilled at reading: new vehicle noises reported at night, changes in radio traffic intercepted and logged, and unusual patterns in the flow of German infantry between adjacent sectors. By mid-June, analysts in the British Second Army headquarters had concluded that a counterstrike toward the Evresis corridor was not just possible but likely. RAF Tactical Air Force squadrons were already positioned to respond. The Typhoon, the aircraft central to the advance, had become one of the most feared weapons the British possessed in Normandy. Its rockets, fired in pairs from rails mounted under the wings, had the capacity to disable or destroy armor with a single hit. But the aircraft's real power came from the precision of the pilots who flew it. These men were trained not only to locate targets but to strike them under conditions that traditional fighter-bomber tactics considered unfavorable. Among the squadrons closest to Evresis, British pilots had been practicing steep-angle descents, tight banking turns, and drop-in attack runs that allowed them to hit concealed targets from directions previously considered impractical. It was not a maneuver without risk. Entering at the wrong angle meant flying directly into anti-aircraft guns without the speed or altitude to evade. Yet the RAF had reached a point where these risks were acceptable if they prevented German armor from breaking into the British line. The German build-up near the ridge was first reported by a British reconnaissance troop whose forward elements had been observing movement for several hours. They radioed their battalion, which then escalated the report up the chain. The British brigade immediately recognized the significance. The enemy was preparing a thrust aimed at exploiting the corridor leading toward the high ground. If they succeeded, the British troops positioned along the northern flank would be exposed to a rapid punch that could compromise the entire advance. Ground artillery could not reach the assembly point without adjusting their positions. Moving the guns would take time. The request went instead to the RAF, whose forward air controllers had been integrated with the ground unit specifically for moments like this. The German armor was massing behind the ridge, shielded by the slope. Traditional air routes would require the Typhoons to pass over open ground heavy with German anti-aircraft guns. The calculation was forbidding. A frontal approach risked unacceptable losses before the rocket salvos could even be fired. But the RAF squadron leaders had studied the ridge weeks earlier. They had mapped its contours, memorized its gradients, and marked a single approach vector, tucked into the angle of the slope, that could allow a fighter to roll sharply at the last moment and descend into the strike zone. The approach was so tight that it bordered on the limits of the Typhoon's turning radius. It required pilots to execute a rapid bank immediately upon crossing the British line, dropping almost sideways for a moment before correcting into a downward angle aimed directly at the reverse slope of the ridge. To the ground troops who witnessed it later, it appeared impossible. But to the RAF pilots, it was a calculated move drilled repeatedly during training flights. While the German armor crews believed the ridge protected them from air attack, British intelligence already understood that their confidence rested on an assumption the RAF no longer accepted. The Typhoons could approach from a direction the Germans had left weakly defended. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned to counter frontal or lateral attacks, not a steep angled descent that slipped into a narrow pocket on the edge of their arc. As British forces prepared for the possibility of a German breakthrough, the RAF squadron received the final order. Engines roared to life on forward airfields. Rockets were checked, fuel lines inspected, and pilots briefed with rapid clarity. Attack the assembly point behind the ridge, enter from the angle previously mapped, and strike before the German armor began its advance. With the plan fixed and coordinated through ground controllers, the RAF launched toward Eversea. The Typhoons climbed in tight formation, the roar of their engines cutting through the early morning calm over northern Eversea. Each pilot was briefed with absolute precision. The approach vector to the ridge had been memorized and drilled repeatedly during training flights. Every second of the attack was planned to minimize exposure to German anti-aircraft fire while maximizing the surprise element. Ground controllers relayed updates on German positions, correcting for any last-minute adjustments. Britain's air strategy demanded that timing align perfectly with ground movements. A single mistimed strike could have allowed German armor to disperse or find cover behind reverse slopes, hedgerows, or farm structures. The Germans had massed an armored company in the folds of the ridge, supported by infantry positioned to secure the high ground. Anti-aircraft emplacements were placed along likely approaches, their 20mm and 37mm guns trained to repel any conventional assault. Yet the British planners had already considered these threats. By approaching from the steep bank at an angle considered impossible, Typhoon pilots could avoid the primary fields of fire, drop rockets from short range, and exit before the enemy could adjust. Every detail of German deployment, every gun position, every troop movement, every anticipated response, had been calculated using aerial reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and reports from forward observers. Back at brigade command, officers watched the ground reports with tense focus. Radio chatter confirmed that German armor remained hidden behind the ridge. The position offered natural concealment from traditional strikes, and most commanders assumed that aircraft could not attack from such a trajectory. The RAF's solution relied not on brute force, but on calculated audacity. Pilots trained to fly close to the ridge, banking sharply at the last possible moment, would appear almost out of nowhere to the German crews below. The precise angle of descent had been rehearsed countless times on British airfields and marked on charts to avoid collisions and maintain cohesion during the high-speed attack. As the Typhoons neared the ridge, ground troops turned their heads, seeing the aircraft slicing across the sky from a direction they had assumed was impossible. Infantry officers radioed updates in disbelief. The RAF had executed a flight path that defied conventional expectations. The ridge, previously considered a safe haven by German armor, now became a target directly from the air. British soldiers on the ground recognized instantly that the outcome of the ridge engagement would depend entirely on the timing, accuracy, and discipline of the aircraft above. German crews below, still confident behind their slope and tree-line cover, had no indication of what was coming. The assembly of tanks and half-tracks continued, waiting for the order to advance, unaware that their position had been fully exposed from a direction they believed secure. Intelligence reports indicated that many of these crews had never encountered an attack along such a trajectory. To them, the approach angle of the Typhoons would appear to be a sudden anomaly, a gap in the natural battlefield geometry that could not exist until the rocket struck. At that moment, British ground controllers confirmed the final approach. The Typhoons aligned perfectly with the mapped vector. Altitudes, angles, and timing all fell into place. Pilots had to maintain focus. Any deviation could result in missing the target or entering anti-aircraft fire. In the cockpit, each man relied on his instruments, visual cues from the terrain, and instinct honed through repeated drills. Precision was critical. Speed alone could not ensure the success of the strike. Seconds later, the Typhoons reached the crest, banking sharply and descending toward the ridge with the accuracy only British training could achieve. From the ground, the aircraft seemed to appear out of nowhere, slicing into the German assembly with impossible precision. The moment marked the culmination of weeks of preparation, intelligence, and rigorous rehearsal, a combination of human skill, technological capability, and doctrinal innovation that turned a theoretically unreachable target into a lethal strike zone. The Germans had neither warning nor the chance to reposition. From Eversea, the British troops stared upward in disbelief, witnessing the calculated execution of a strike designed to exploit every flaw in the enemy's expectations. The first rockets were released. The ridge trembled with the impact of the Typhoon's attack. And in that instant, the impossible became reality. The Germans had counted on concealment, on the ridge masking their armor, on the slope creating a natural shield against air attack. They did not expect the RAF to exploit an angle that human intuition deemed impossible. When the first Typhoons appeared, the German crews froze. Tanks that had been shifting in formation slowed, commanders shouted orders that could not reach every soldier. From Eversea, British infantry witnessed the precision of the strike with disbelief. Aircraft were banking sharply, descending along a trajectory that seemed to defy physics, and striking targets that had been considered invulnerable from above. The element of surprise was not accidental. Weeks of British reconnaissance, mapping, and rehearsed approaches had calculated every variable: gun placement, troop positioning, vehicle orientation. The RAF's Typhoons were trained to appear only for a few seconds before the rockets fired, disappearing almost as quickly as they had arrived. The German crews had no visual cues that could warn them until the salvo hit. Explosions ripped through vehicles and personnel, leaving little time for reaction. The psychological effect was immediate. Officers hesitated, gunners abandoned their sights, and infantry scattered into unprepared cover. The strike proved that a well-timed and meticulously executed approach could undermine even the most confident defensive planning. The British advantage lay in this controlled chaos. The ridge had been considered a sanctuary for German armor, but the RAF turned it into a killing zone by exploiting angles that made the defenders' assumptions irrelevant. The shock of the attack carried far beyond physical damage. It reshaped the battlefield perception of what the enemy believed possible. Every rocket fired from the Typhoon was calculated to hit with exactitude. British pilots relied on careful coordination with ground observers, cross-referencing distances, angles, and expected movement of German tanks and half-tracks. The attack run required absolute synchronization. The moment of release, the bank angle, and the speed had to converge perfectly. One miscalculation could have sent the rockets harmlessly past the target, or worse, into British positions below. Inside the cockpit, pilots followed the approach vector like a moving line on a graph. Each second of descent mattered. As the aircraft banked sharply toward the ridge, targeting computers and human calculation intersected. The rockets tore through hedgerows, struck engine decks, and blasted tracks, immobilizing vehicles before crews could react. The precision extended to infantry positions as well. German soldiers caught in the open had nowhere to hide. British ground controllers adjusted in real time, guiding the Typhoons to where enemy formations shifted, ensuring maximum damage. This combination of planning, rehearsal, and disciplined execution made the strike devastating. The RAF demonstrated that air power was not merely about firepower, but about timing, calculation, and methodical execution of tactics that could turn a natural defensive advantage into a liability. The ridge, once a shield for the Germans, became an exhibition of British mastery of aerial precision. The success of the strike depended on seamless integration between the RAF and the British ground units. Forward observers relayed live information on German positions, while squadron leaders adjusted flight paths to match the evolving situation on the ridge. Radio transmissions were brief, exact, and constant, ensuring pilots remained aware of shifting formations without being overloaded with unnecessary detail. The infantry's response to the sudden attack was equally critical. Soldiers avoided firing in panic, focusing instead on protecting vulnerable flanks and marking targets for the aircraft. Artillery units withheld fire until the strike had passed to prevent friendly casualties. The entire engagement reflected a choreography of movement, timing, and situational awareness. The strike's impact was amplified not just by the rockets themselves, but by the cohesion of British forces operating as a single, coordinated entity. From Eversea, the interaction between ground and air units exemplified a level of discipline that the German commanders had not anticipated. Each action, pilot, observer, infantryman, was a part of a greater system that could overwhelm enemy forces with minimal exposure to risk. Coordination, training, and trust allowed the impossible angle attack to succeed with devastating efficiency, leaving German units reeling and the British advance uninterrupted. The strike on the Eversea Ridge was not simply an application of existing tactics, it represented a deliberate innovation in the use of air power. British planners had recognized that the traditional frontal approach was predictable and would expose aircraft to concentrated German anti-aircraft fire. By exploiting a steep bank and unconventional vector, the Typhoons introduced a method of attack that defied enemy expectations. This innovation required rigorous testing in training. Pilots practiced sudden bank descents at high speed, timing their rocket salvos to strike exact coordinates. Engineers calculated the limits of airframe stress, while intelligence officers analyzed German anti-aircraft zones to identify gaps. The approach vector used in the operation was refined until it could be executed repeatedly with minimal risk. When the RAF finally deployed this tactic over Eversea, it was not improvisation, it was a precise method honed through weeks of preparation. The impact was immediate. German armor and infantry, positioned to repel standard airstrikes, found themselves exposed to a trajectory they had never anticipated. Vehicles were disabled, crews thrown into confusion, and the element of surprise compounded the lethality of each rocket. The combination of technological capability, pilot skill, and tactical creativity demonstrated the RAF's ability to adapt and innovate under the pressures of the Normandy campaign. The operation also highlighted decisive leadership at multiple levels. Squadron commanders in the air made split-second choices while maintaining formation integrity. Ground officers ensured that British infantry held positions, avoided interference with the aircraft, and relayed accurate target updates. The coordination was achieved through strict adherence to command protocols and trust in subordinate judgment. Leadership mattered not only in decision-making but in discipline. Pilots executing the steep-angle approach had to resist the instinct to pull up early or alter trajectory under anti-aircraft fire. Ground officers had to maintain composure as rockets tore into enemy formations. Every role required confidence in training, trust in the plan, and calm execution. The success of the strike relied as much on mental discipline and command authority as it did on the rockets themselves. The strike's immediate effect on the battlefield was devastating for the Germans. Tanks were disabled, half-tracks destroyed, and infantry caught in open ground suffered severe casualties. But the strategic impact extended beyond the ridge. By neutralizing the assembly point, the RAF prevented the planned German counterattack from gaining momentum, preserving the integrity of the British advance through the sector. British forces retained operational tempo. Forward reconnaissance units encountered reduced resistance, and artillery units were able to redeploy with minimal disruption. The psychological impact on both sides was significant. British troops witnessed the power of integrated air-ground tactics, while German forces were forced to reassess defensive assumptions. The strike validated the RAF's training, planning, and innovative approaches, proving that precise coordination and audacity could achieve results previously considered impossible. The moment at Eversea would later be studied as a textbook example of combined arms execution, where skill, technology, and tactical foresight intersected to overcome natural and man-made defensive advantages. The Typhoons appeared over Eversea with precision that had been rehearsed countless times. From the ground, British infantry barely had a moment to register the aircraft's sudden appearance. The first rockets tore into the German assembly, striking engine decks, tracks, and anti-aircraft positions with surgical accuracy. Crews scrambled inside tanks, shouting orders that could not be executed fast enough. The ridge, once considered secure, erupted in a controlled chaos the Germans had never anticipated. Carter, commanding a forward British infantry company, watched as the ridge seemed to implode under the Typhoon salvo. Tanks halted mid-movement, crews throwing themselves behind what cover they could find. Anti-aircraft gunners fired in desperation, but the trajectory of the aircraft made their guns almost irrelevant. British soldiers, initially stunned, recognized the opportunity. The ridge had been softened, the assembly point disrupted, and German formations exposed. The first wave of rockets had done more than destroy vehicles, it had shattered the enemy's confidence. Commanders tried to rally men, but communication lines were already compromised by the sudden destruction and scattered radio networks. Vehicles stalled in awkward positions, blocking each other and creating bottlenecks. Typhoons swooped again, banking sharply from the improbable angle, and struck new targets with unerring accuracy. Every pilot executed the steep dive with disciplined precision. A slight miscalculation would have ended in failure or catastrophic loss, but the RAF's training held. Ground controllers adjusted the targeting in real time, directing aircraft toward moving armor and gaps in cover. The ridge, previously thought invulnerable, became a lethal tableau where British technological advantage, planning, and audacity intersected. As the attack continued, German infantry attempted to move between tanks, hoping to escape or support their armor. The Typhoons responded, rockets cutting through lines of vehicles and suppressing enemy positions. Explosions and smoke filled the ridge, creating a visual and psychological shock that disoriented crews and soldiers alike. The impossibility of the angle compounded the effect. Every strike seemed to come from nowhere, undermining German situational awareness and command structure. From the ground, British officers coordinated with the aircraft to ensure minimal risk to their men. Mortar units held fire, rifle sections marked enemy positions, and signals relayed live updates to pilots. The combination of precision, timing, and audacity allowed the RAF to exploit every gap in the enemy's defense. By the midpoint of the run, the ridge was effectively neutralized. Tanks were immobilized, anti-aircraft positions destroyed, and infantry scattered. German commanders realized their planned counterattack had been preempted, the element of surprise had been decisively taken from them. The British infantry, now free to advance, began to move forward with cautious speed, securing positions previously contested. The strike continued, the Typhoons maintaining the steep, improbable descent over the ridge. Explosions echoed across the sector as rockets struck remaining vehicles and positions. Ground controllers fed updates, confirming destruction and marking residual threats. Every movement was orchestrated, every strike deliberate. The Germans had underestimated the RAF's capability to exploit terrain in ways considered impossible. By the time the final rockets were released, the ridge had been transformed from a fortified assembly point into a landscape of wrecked armor, shattered earth, and demoralized infantry. British forces had not only survived the German counterattack, they had preempted it, breaking its cohesion before it could threaten the advance. From Eversea, the infantry stared in disbelief, the impossible angle of attack now a grim reality. The RAF's precision had redefined the battlefield, and British forces understood that their momentum was secured not by chance, but by planning, coordination, and the audacity to attack from where no one expected. The German commanders, still reeling from the initial strikes, scrambled to reorganize their remaining armor and infantry. Vehicles blocked the ridge's narrow paths, crews emerging from hatches to assess the damage. But the RAF was relentless. Typhoons banked sharply, exploiting the same improbable angle, hitting targets that seemed to have been protected by terrain. Tracks were ripped open, turrets shattered, and ammunition stores detonated in fireballs that illuminated the ridge in bursts of smoke and debris. Carter and his company observed the devastation with measured urgency. Their infantry squads advanced carefully through the lane left clear by the initial strike, taking positions to secure residual pockets of resistance. German soldiers attempted to regroup behind broken vehicles and hedgerows, but coordination was impossible. Radio networks had been disrupted, and the psychological shock of the strike left men uncertain where to move. The combination of aerial precision and disciplined infantry action had transformed the ridge from a threat into an opportunity. The Typhoon's repeated runs exploited every weakness. Pilots timed their dives to align with enemy movement, striking half-tracks as they attempted to retreat, blasting infantry clusters attempting to take cover, and neutralizing anti-aircraft positions that had managed to survive the first wave. Ground controllers continuously updated targeting information, calling out adjustments in real time. Each run reinforced the dominance of British air power, demonstrating that training and audacity could overcome even the most carefully prepared defenses. Amid the chaos, German armor tried to mount a countermeasure. A Panzer IV shifted position to fire on the approaching infantry, exposing its side plate. A Typhoon pilot, following the pre-planned trajectory, fired rockets at point-blank range. The resulting explosion disabled the tank instantly, scattering the crew. Another vehicle attempted to move up the ridge to support it, but precise targeting from a second aircraft destroyed it before it could gain momentum. The remaining infantry hesitated, their cohesion shattered by the sustained aerial assault. British forces exploited every gap. Infantry squads advanced alongside the ridge, firing into positions cleared by rockets, preventing German troops from regrouping. Artillery units, now able to move freely, positioned to provide covering fire for the continuing advance. Each movement complemented the aerial assault, turning what could have been a deadly trap into a fully controlled battlefield. The psychological effect on German troops was profound. Soldiers who had anticipated a secure assembly point found themselves exposed to strikes from impossible angles. Officers struggled to maintain order, shouting commands that rarely reached their intended recipients. Confusion and fear spread rapidly, leaving individuals isolated and vulnerable. British infantry and artillery capitalized on this, pressing forward while the ridge continued to burn and smoke. By the final passes, the ridge was neutralized completely. Wrecked tanks, destroyed half-tracks, and scattered infantry bore testament to the RAF's precision and planning. German counterattack plans were utterly broken. The ridge that had been considered a strong defensive position was now a cleared zone under British control. The Typhoons banked and climbed, leaving behind a battlefield dominated by Britain's tactical foresight and air power, their mission accomplished with minimal losses. Carter's infantry moved into the positions once occupied by the enemy, consolidating control and securing the corridor for the larger brigade advance. Engineers and reconnaissance units began clearing remaining obstacles, documenting destroyed vehicles, and marking any hazards. The combination of precise aerial assault, disciplined infantry movement, and effective command ensured that the British advance could continue without interruption. From Eversea, British troops looked up at the ridge one last time. The impossible angle that had stunned them hours earlier now seemed a decisive factor in the day's operations. The ridge, once a threat capable of halting their advance, had become proof of British planning, coordination, and audacity. Every element, from the pilots executing precise dives to the infantry seizing cleared positions, had worked in unison to preempt a German attack that could have changed the course of the sector. The ridge was silent. The German counterattack had been annihilated. The British advance was secured. And in that quiet dominance, the effectiveness of audacious planning, disciplined execution, and precise coordination had been etched into the landscape of Eversea. The ridge, once a potential spearhead for a German counterattack, lay in ruins. Burnt-out half-tracks, immobilized Panzer IVs, and scattered infantry littered the slopes. British infantry, who had initially watched the Typhoon's impossible angle attack in disbelief, now moved methodically through the area, securing positions and consolidating control. Every squad knew that the ridge had been the focal point of a calculated German plan, and that the RAF strike had not merely neutralized the threat but preserved the momentum of the British advance across northern Eversea. Field reports began to arrive at brigade command. German armor had suffered catastrophic losses: 2 Panzer IVs destroyed, half-tracks disabled, and anti-aircraft positions wiped out. Infantry units supporting the ridge were scattered, with remaining soldiers retreating under pressure. British casualties were minimal, limited to a handful of shrapnel injuries among troops briefly exposed during the initial aerial strikes. Medical teams worked efficiently, collecting the wounded and sending them to rear treatment stations while maintaining the forward push. Engineers and reconnaissance units swept the ridge to assess remaining hazards. Rockets that had failed to detonate were carefully neutralized, while craters and debris were marked for movement planning. British artillery units began repositioning along the cleared corridor, taking advantage of the destruction to prepare for the next stage of operations. The ridge had been cleared not by frontal assault or prolonged infantry combat, but through a coordinated combination of air power and ground guidance, an approach that ensured minimal disruption to the brigade's timetable. Intelligence officers catalogued destroyed vehicles and equipment. The Typhoon strike had disrupted not only the immediate threat but also German command cohesion. Officers attempting to rally their troops found communication lines severed, radios destroyed, and formations fractured. The loss of armor and key defensive positions meant that German units in adjacent sectors had to divert forces to contain the retreat, further weakening their broader operational capability. Carter's company moved through the cleared positions with measured efficiency. Infantrymen checked hedgerows and outbuildings for any remaining opposition, ensuring that no hidden pockets could regroup. Signals officers coordinated with the RAF to provide updates for follow-up strikes if necessary, while engineers prepared paths for supply and artillery units. Every action reflected a disciplined understanding that control of the ridge was essential not only tactically but strategically. As the British units advanced, they began to push beyond the ridge toward previously contested terrain. Forward observation posts relayed information about remaining German forces, though resistance was scattered and uncoordinated. Brigade command adjusted operational plans in real time, accelerating movements that might have been delayed if the ridge had remained under enemy control. The strike had not only neutralized an immediate threat but had enabled a broader operational tempo to continue unbroken. The ridge, now dominated by British forces, became a reference point for combined arms efficiency. Ground troops, artillery, and engineers operated in synchrony with intelligence gathered from reconnaissance and aerial observation. The destruction of German armor and disruption of command had created a corridor through which the brigade could move with confidence, knowing that subsequent operations would face reduced resistance. From the vantage point of the secured positions, Carter and his officers assessed the ridge's transformation. What had been a potential catastrophe had become a decisive victory through planning, coordination, and precise execution. The British forces could now advance with momentum preserved, the ridge serving as a stark testament to the effectiveness of the RAF's audacious strike and the disciplined response of ground units. The momentum gained from the ridge strike rippled through the brigade's operational planning. German units, forced to abandon their positions, fell back into disarray. Reports indicated that remaining armor was either destroyed or immobilized, while infantry scattered in isolated groups. Field intelligence confirmed that the planned counterattack had been rendered impossible, the assembly point was gone, command cohesion shattered, and morale severely undermined. British troops exploited this disruption immediately. Forward reconnaissance moved rapidly along previously contested approaches, marking enemy positions and reporting threats for follow-up strikes. Infantry advanced carefully, clearing pockets of resistance with minimal casualties. Artillery repositioned to dominate the newly accessible terrain, providing covering fire for the continuing push. The coordination between air and ground forces had preserved operational tempo, allowing the brigade to maintain initiative in a sector where hesitation could have been costly. The destroyed German armor told a stark story. Panzer IVs lay overturned or gutted by rocket fire, their tracks twisted and turrets frozen in mid-turn. Half-tracks were scattered, some smoldering, others abandoned with crew inside. Ammunition stores had detonated under the precision strikes, leaving craters and scorched earth as visual evidence of the effectiveness of the RAF's approach. British engineers catalogued the wreckage, documenting the impact for post-battle analysis and training purposes. Each destroyed vehicle was not only a tactical gain but a piece of intelligence on enemy dispositions, armor resilience, and vulnerability. Psychologically, the effect was profound. British infantry recognized that air support could strike where the enemy believed they were secure. The impossible angle attack demonstrated a level of precision and audacity that reshaped battlefield expectations. German troops, in contrast, confronted both physical destruction and the demoralizing realization that their defenses had been outmaneuvered by planning, skill, and audacity. Panic and confusion prevented any attempt at organized withdrawal, leaving many to surrender or retreat in piecemeal groups. Brigade command assessed the broader implications. The failure of the counterattack preserved the British line and allowed operations to proceed according to the original timetable, if not accelerated. Supplies, reinforcements, and artillery could move unimpeded along cleared routes. The ridge, once a German stronghold, had been transformed into a forward reference point for coordination, observation, and continued offensive operations. The engagement served as a model for integrating precision airstrikes with disciplined infantry and artillery movements, a textbook example of combined arms success under the most challenging circumstances. Carter's company continued its advance, securing each sector while maintaining communication with both higher command and air support. Engineers removed obstacles, signalers relayed updated positions, and infantry cleared remaining resistance. The destroyed armor and scattered infantry highlighted the cost of miscalculating British air-ground coordination. Every action taken by the RAF, forward controllers, and ground troops had amplified the effect of the strike, producing outcomes far greater than raw firepower alone. By late afternoon, the sector was firmly under British control. The impossible angle strike had achieved both immediate tactical objectives and strategic advantages. It eliminated the German counterattack, secured the advance corridor, and bolstered confidence in combined operations. The ridge stood as evidence of disciplined planning, audacious execution, and the enduring capacity of British forces to exploit innovation in warfare. From the cleared positions, Carter and his officers looked across the ridge, observing the remnants of the enemy's failed counterattack. The operation had preserved initiative, minimized British losses, and created opportunities for subsequent advances. The precision of the IAF strike, combined with disciplined infantry movement, ensured that the tactical and psychological impact would resonate throughout the brigade and beyond, shaping both immediate operations and lessons for future engagements in Normandy. The ridge outside Évrecy had once promised disaster for British forces, a potential breakthrough point for German armor and infantry that could have disrupted the entire advance. Instead, it became a testament to planning, precision, and audacity. The RAF strike, executed from an angle deemed impossible, demonstrated that careful preparation and disciplined execution could overcome terrain, expectations, and numerical parity. Britain's forces had turned what seemed like vulnerability into a decisive advantage. For the pilots of the Typhoons, the operation reinforced the value of innovation under pressure. Weeks of rehearsal, intelligence gathering, and technical refinement culminated in moments of perfect execution. The steep angle dives and pinpoint rocket strikes were not acts of improvisation, they were the embodiment of doctrine adapted to the unique challenges of Normandy. Each aircraft, each pilot, became a vector of decisive action, illustrating the synergy of human skill and technological capability. For the infantry on the ground, the experience underscored the importance of coordination and trust. Soldiers who initially stared in disbelief at the aerial assault quickly recognized its effect. German formations were immobilized, anti-aircraft fire rendered ineffective, and the ridge itself transformed from threat to opportunity. The integration of air and ground forces had created a force multiplier, where precision, timing, and audacity combined to achieve results far greater than the sum of their parts. For the German troops, the ridge served as a harsh lesson in underestimating the capabilities of the RAF and the adaptability of British planning. Positions that had seemed secure, terrain that had offered natural protection, and assumptions about the limits of air attack were all invalidated. The psychological impact was profound, eroding confidence, cohesion, and the ability to mount even a partial counterattack. Ultimately, the events at Évrecy illustrate a fundamental principle of warfare: advantage lies not solely in firepower or numbers, but in the application of skill, coordination, and daring at critical moments. The ridge, once a threat, had been transformed into a symbol of British mastery of combined arms tactics. In the hours following the strike, British forces moved forward with preserved momentum, while the Germans were left to contend with the consequences of miscalculation. The impossible angle, the precise execution, and the disciplined integration of air and ground units left a lasting imprint on the Normandy campaign. It was a moment where planning, courage, and innovation converged, where Britain's forces demonstrated not just power, but the vision and audacity to reshape the battlefield itself.